Hello and welcome to my video where I'm going to show you how to knit a scalloped necklace. For some reason I hardly ever seem to see any knitted jewellery, but I actually think that knitting lends itself well to jewellery making, especially when you consider all of the delicate edging patterns that are available. In order to make this design yourself, you're going to need some yarn, some knitting needles, a pair of scissors, a short piece of sturdy wire, some jewellery components, jewellery pliers and wire cutters, a yarn needle and some metallic cord or thread. Okay, so to begin you need to cast on 41 stitches. I used the long tail cast on, but you could use any method. You then need to repeat the following pattern until you've only got one stitch on the needle. So that's knit 2, then you need to lift 6 stitches over the working yarn. So bring the working yarn from the back between the needles to the front and lay it over the left hand needle, like so. Then use your right hand needle to pick up the first stitch on the left hand needle, take it over this strand of working yarn and drop it off the end of the needle. Then do the same for the next 5 stitches. So pick up the stitch, take it over the working yarn and drop it off the end of the needle. Pick up the stitch, take it over the yarn and drop it off the end of the needle, and so on. As you can see, I'm using my thumbnail to keep that strand of working yarn on the needle. Once you've done that, you just need to knit a stitch. And that's the pattern repeat completed. So you just do that over and over until you've only got one stitch left. So knit 2, bring the working yarn to the front of the left hand needle, then lift 6 stitches over this yarn, and then knit 1 stitch. And then repeat that again. So that's knit 2, lift 6 stitches over the working yarn, and knit 1. And so on until you've only got 1 stitch left. And finally you just knit the last stitch. Once you've completed that first row, you'll have 5 scallops. Then for row 2, you just purl across the row. For row 3, you just knit across the row. And for row 4, we're going to bind off, but we're going to bind off on a purl row. So you need to purl 2 stitches, then bind off 1 stitch by using your left hand needle to pick up the second stitch down on the right hand needle, taking it over the stitch above and dropping it off the end of the needle. Then repeat purl 1, bind off 1 until the end of the row. So that's purl 1, bind off 1, purl 1, bind off 1, and so on. Once you've only got 1 stitch left, cut the working yarn to leave you with a yarn tail at least 6 inches long. Then take this yarn tail through the last stitch and tighten. Then feed each of the 2 yarn tails into your yarn needle and weave them into the back of your knitting. Then just cut off the excess yarn. Right, so now you've completed the 5 scallop layer, you now need to knit the 3 scallop layer. So this time you only need to cast on 25 stitches, and then you follow the exact same pattern. So that's knit 2 stitches, then lift 6 stitches over the working yarn, and knit 1. You then just repeat this 2 more times, and then finish with a knit 1. Then row 2 is a purl row. Row 3 is a knit row. And for row 4, you bind off on a purl row. Then once again, cut the working yarn, take the yarn tail through the last stitch and tighten. Please note that now you only need to weave in the first yarn tail, which is the yarn tail you created at the beginning of the knitting. The last yarn tail you created at the end needs to be used to join the 2 knitted pieces together. So now just feed the end of it into a yarn needle. Centre the 5 scallop layer on top of the 3 scallop layer, then turn them over so you can see the back. Then sew these layers together using the basic whip stitch. So just take the needle under 1 stitch on one layer, under 1 stitch on the other layer, and just keep repeating that all the way along. As you sew along, keep checking that the layers are still lining up. Once you're happy with the result, weave the rest of the yarn tail into the back of the knitting. Next, you need to cut a length of sturdy wire that's about 1 inch longer on each side than the top of your knitted pendant. Form it into a semicircle shape like so. Feed this wire into the top of the pendant, choosing 1 line of stitches to pick up. I chose a line of stitches just behind the bound off edge. Don't worry too much that you're picking up exactly the right stitches, you just want to make sure you're picking them up evenly, so every stitch or every other stitch. Then use rounded jewellery pliers to form each end of the wire into a loop. Then cut off the excess wire and neaten up the loops. Next, you need to attach a jump ring and a length of chain to each of these wire loops. Then at the other ends of the chain, add a jump ring to one side and a jump ring and a lobster clasp to the other. If you want to add some metallic thread, first feed a length of it into your yarn needle. Take the needle through the pendant from the back, making sure to leave enough of a tail to weave in later, and then weave the thread into the front of your knitting. Try and follow the scallop pattern and pick up every other strand of yarn in the path that you're following. Make sure to finish by taking the thread to the back of the knitting. Then just weave the tails of thread into the back of the knitting to secure them. And that's it, your necklace is now complete. I really like how it turned out and I hope you do too. Thank you very much for watching.